We've talked about how to choose different elements that we want to modify. Now we're going to talk about what we can actually change about those elements. So these are going to be the properties that we end up looking at. So visual rules are all the ways that you can change the element that you select with a selector. So if you remember, we talked about selectors are how you pick what you want to change. The visual rules are what we actually are changing about them. So the visual rule includes the property and the value that you're setting for that property. So the first category that we're going to look at is some of the font visual rules. So you've got font family. So if you write font-family, that means you can change the font family. You can change what font it is. So Helvetica, Calibri, Times New Roman, Comic Sans, etc. Those are all examples of font families. Font size lets you change how big or small it is. This is typically going to be with pixel numbers, but there's also other ways to set that. Font weight changes how thick or thin or bold the text is. And then lastly, it should probably not be a surprise at this point, but the first word is font dash, and then we say align, or sorry, that's not font. It is a surprise because it's text. Text dash align changes how the text is aligned. So if it's on the left side of the page, the right side of the, left side of the element, the right side of the element, centered, or kind of spread out throughout. So those are some basic font visual rules that we can change. And then I've alluded to some of the values. For font family, the value would be what font we want to use. For font size, the value would be the actual number that you put in. For font weight, there'll be a number or a description that says how thick or thin it is. And for text align, you'll say things like left, center, or align for the value. Some other common visual rules that we use, there's color. So if you type color, that will change the color of an element. If you type background dash color, that will change the color of the box around or behind the element. So all of our text, when it's on a web page, are in these boxes. All of our pictures and stuff are in these boxes, which we'll talk about later. But basically, the background changes the color of everything behind the text. You can also use background image if you like. Background image. And that will change the same thing that would be the background that would be a solid color. You can put an image instead by loading a URL or referencing a specific image. And then lastly, you've got opacity, which changes how opaque or see-through an element is. So if you set the opacity to one extreme, it won't actually show up on the page. It'll be invisible because you can see through it. If you set it to the other extreme, it'll be block anything behind it. But if you set it somewhere in the middle, you can kind of see through it a little bit. And then lastly, there is this idea of an important rule. If in your CSS, when you're defining it, if you write important with an exclamation point at the beginning, that will always apply. So it will override any other rules that are applying to this thing. So if you think back to when we talked about specificity, this will apply after everything else. This will be the last thing that gets applied. And so it just, anything that it's different from, it overrides it and it changes it. This you'll want to use very, very, very sparingly and only for things that you know for a fact this is critical and it must be this way for a very good reason. Otherwise, you'll want to use all of the other formatting and stuff because that way it's easier for someone to come in after you or for you to look at it later and make changes and adjustments. But that will wrap up kind of the different visual rules that we can set. If you have questions, let me know.